The top of the mountain was actually once the bottom of a valley a long time ago, with compacted quartz forming its base due to an underground volcano. Over time, the sandstone above and around what would become Table Mountain eroded into the ocean to leave what looks like the bottom half of a mountain. It has a cool phenomenon that occurs during the summer where clouds form over its head, making it look like a cloth. The cloud formation is due to southeasterly winds that blow from the sea, hitting the mountain, then being forced up to cooler air, allowing moisture to condense into clouds. The thin clouds look like a waterfall in the sky as it falls over the mountain's precipice. It's pretty amazing. This cloth-like cloud has also curiously created a local tale about a normal person and the devil having a smoking competition. Meet Jan van Hunk, a retired pirate from the early 1700s who gave up his stealing and pillaging to live with his wife at the foot of a mountain called Devil's Peak. For some context, Devil's Peak is located right beside Table Mountain. Day after day, he would smoke in the house, stinking up everything until his wife physically chased him out to smoke outside. On one summer day, as he was walking up on his daily trek to his favorite smoking spot, there was another person already sitting there. This stranger was covered in a cloak and wore a top hat to obscure his head. I wonder who he could be. Jan van Hunk then said, "Hey man, you're in my spot, scram it," in a South African accent. The stranger went, "Sorry pal, I'll head off, but could you just give me some tobacco? I'm all out." "Okay sure," he said, "but I'll have you know, these lungs can outsmoke any tobacco addict in the world." "Oh really?" the hooded stranger replied. "Well, my lungs have been puffing tobacco for decades. I bet I could beat you in a smoke-off." "You're on," Van Hunk replied in a South African accent. So they started smoking, Van Hunk sharing his tobacco between them. Something strange about this old folktale is that today, it's basically become a kid's story around Cape Town, making the copious references to smoking and the devil a little concerning. The two kept smoking against each other. Day turns into night, and they don't seem to be slowing down. As they battle, the smoke they puff up continues to accumulate and flow onto Table Mountain, covering it in a fog. Van Hunk and the stranger continue to smoke the seemingly bottomless supply of tobacco for multiple days until the stranger eventually collapses exhausted. As he fell, however, his top hat fell off, revealing two bright red horns on his forehead. Van Hunk gasped, realizing the person he was smoking with was actually the devil. Right before he gets the chance to gloat that he beat the devil in a smoke-off, the devil grabs him and then they both disappear into a cloud of smoke. The end. Alright, so there are several strange things about this story, but one thing I find interesting is the name of the mountain, Devil's Peak. If the mountain was called Devil's Peak in the story and not because of the story, then why on earth is there a mountain called Devil's Peak in Cape Town? Well, there are actually a few possibilities. Devil's Peak was originally called Charles Mountain when the British took Cape Town from the Dutch East India Company in 1795. One theory for how it got its name is due to the Dutch word for devil, duivel, being similar to the Dutch word for dove, duif. As the Dutch people who first occupied Cape Town settled in, they would have given names relevant to their own culture and religion. But when the British took over, they then mistranslated the Dutch term when their cartographers began laying down official map names, creating the mountain we know today. Another theory is that Devil's Peak is the result of Cape Town's old name, Devil's Cape. Sailors called it that because of its treacherous waters that sunk countless ships. The answer is probably a bit of both. So that explains the mountain's name more or less, but still, it seems a bit too big of a coincidence that a mountain called Devil's Peak has a story about a devil and a person having a smoking competition in the 1700s. The reasonable explanation would be that the story inspired the name of Devil's Peak, but that doesn't seem to be the case. So the only other real explanation would be that the name of the mountain inspired the story. But who would even come up with a story about a guy challenging the devil to a smoke-off? This is Dante Gabriel Rossetti, a famous poet from England who wrote a story about an old smoker called Jan van Hunk that challenged the devil to a smoke-off. Ah, so this guy must be the origin of the Cape Town folk tale. Well, strangely enough, Dante was born in 1828. Meanwhile, the story in Cape Town is said to have originated in the early 1700s. Now, no matter how you look at it, these two stories are way too similar to be a coincidence. But before you start accusing Rossetti of plagiarizing the Cape Town tale, hear this. Unlike the Cape Town story, Rossetti's story occurs in Van Hunk's own home, where the devil enters to challenge him to a smoke-off. Rosetti's story also occurs in winter, however the Cape Town folktale occurs in the summer, since warm summer air is what causes the clouds to form over Table Mountain in the first place. Rossetti realistically wouldn't have known about the folktale of Cape Town, considering he lived in England his whole life, and this wasn't an internationally famous story that everyone had heard of, it was just in Cape Town. Rossetti, however, was an internationally famous poet whose stories travelled all through Europe and in turn the discovered world. It would make more sense that Rossetti's poem about Van Hunk versus the devil would have spread by sailors towards Cape Town rather than the other way around. If this was the case, then it's not that big a stretch of the imagination to think that the citizens of Cape Town heard the story of Van Hunk by Rossetti and attributed it to the clouds forming on top of Table Mountain. It might even have been part of the reason why the name Devil's Peak stuck for so long without being changed. I can imagine a person just responding to a kid who asked why the mountain was cloudy and said, oh, it's because Van Hunk was having a smoking competition with the devil, and then it stuck. The people of Cape Town probably integrated Rossetti's story to include their famous landmarks, changing the season, location, time of the story, and even John Van Hunk's occupation to fit the narrative of their tradition. And finally, the story about John Van Hunk, a retired pirate who had a smoking competition with the devil on Devil's Peak, was made. Sadly for Rossetti, he wasn't alive to see his story's cultural impact. After the death of his wife due to a drug overdose, and a terrible response from critics to his first collection of poetry, Rossetti would suffer a mental breakdown in 1872, which led him down a depressing spiral of drug and alcohol abuse, eventually leading to his death in 1882 due to a kidney disease he had suffered with for some time. All the unpublished poetry throughout his life was then released, including the tale of Jean Van Hunk. It can be said that Rossetti's influence on art culture as a whole was massive. He is now touted to have been a significant contributor to the aesthetic movement of the late 19th century. I find it fascinating that a famous artist's story, made public after he died a failure, and a small mistranslation about the name of a mountain, managed to plant the seeds of a widespread folktale that has now become part of Cape Town's culture. It really goes to show that culture is not just a solid object that can be conserved over time, but is more like a cloud flowing in the wind, accumulating and growing as time moves on.